Hello guys, I apologize in advance if there is any construction noise in the background as there is a reconstruction in my neighborhood and I don't think they're gonna finish anytime soon and I have to record this video. So on Tuesday, the foreign minister of the UAE, Abdullah Bin Zayed, paid a visit, official visit to Syria and he met President Assad. This is the first official meeting between President Assad and the senior Arab official since 2011. So in my opinion, Tuesday marked a new stage or a new phase in the Syrian war, and I will explain to you why. At the beginning of the war in 2011 and 2012, the UAE participated in conferences called Friends of Syria. This conference included over 100 countries, and they were basically anti-Syria and anti-Assad coalition. However, back then, the UAE didn't provide a military support or any tangible support to the rebels. And it was politically correct back then to participate in such a conference as the entire environment in the region was like heading towards the so-called Arab Spring. And the UAE didn't realize that this is heading towards, in Arabic we say ikhwanization, which means the forces affiliated to the Muslim Brotherhood will have the lead in the region. But in 2011, 12, 13, when the UAE saw that the forces affiliated to Qatar and Turkey, and those are mainly the Muslim Brotherhood forces, have reached to power especially in Egypt, and then also before that in Libya, it was an alarm for them, and they have recalculated their policies. And because of this polarization between Saudi Arabia and the UAE on one side, and the other side Qatar and Turkey, these two conflicting sides, they conflicted, especially in 2014. So there was clearly two camps have been created between these powerful Sunni countries in the region. However, at the same time, the UAE was following the situation in Syria, and it was pretty obvious as well that the forces fighting against Assad are mostly affiliated to the Muslim Brotherhood, also the other radical jihadists who were created thanks to the support coming from Turkey and Qatar. I mean, were it not for Doha and Ankara, there is no ISIS and al-Nusra in Syria. It's true that Saudi Arabia also participated in this, and the ideology of Wahhabism played an instrumental role. But the two backers who were able to enable ISIS and al-Nusra in Syria, it was first Turkey and to Qatar, especially Turkey because it has over 600 to 800 kilometer borders with Syria, and it opened the borders to the multinational jihadists who traveled all over the world to come to Syria, right? So there were changes happening in the region, and the UAE was following this. And especially that the UAE doesn't like the Muslim Brotherhood, and these forces are reaching to power. Now, in 2018, Saudi Arabia officially stopped supporting the so-called rebels in Syria, and especially Jaish al-Islam, Islam's army that occupied the suburbs of Damascus for a long time. And they were bused to some of them to Idlib, others were to Jarablus, and they joined the Turkish ranks. And since then, especially this camp that I mentioned, the UAE and the Saudi camp, and behind them there is Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, and other forces. They started to open diplomatic and security channels with Syria. The UAE opened its embassy in 2018, and Saudi Arabia started talking to Syria through security channels. So what we have seen today in 2021 is a work that precedes. We have to go back in 2018 when these channels started to be created, and talks were held between the both sides on multiple occasions. Of course, most of them are secret. So this is just a fruit of what was happening in the past 2 years. And today there is a situation that it's acceptable to talk to President Assad. At least there is no veto by the United States, despite the statement of the spokesperson of the US State Department who says they didn't give a green light or orange light to the UAE to talk to Assad. But let's be clear, the United States doesn't mind now in 2021 for the Arab countries to talk to Assad, and this is also partly due to a pressure or lobbying happened from the UAE and the Jordanian side in the US, in Washington, for them to deal with Syria, and two, because Biden, as I mentioned, he's shifting his strategy in Syria, and these changes that happened have positively had a positive impact, let's say, on the Syrian situation. Now, why the UAE is in Syria? In my opinion, there are two reasons. One is economics. The UAE wants to invest in Syria. Now, this era reminds me of 1990, 1991, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And back then, it also marked the fall of the Soviet Union. So Syria had no international power that can back Syria back then. So Syria joined the US coalition against Iraq in order to appease the Americans. In exchange, the Americans promised Syria a honorable peace deal with Israel in exchange, and also the return of the Golan Heights, which never materialized. But the important part in this was Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries funneled money into Syria. And it was a very difficult economic situation also in the 90s. At the beginning of the 90s, there was an economic crisis hitting Syria. And this money has improved, let's say, the economic situation in Syria. And nowadays it's the same, almost the same. I mean, Syria, I mentioned a few times, it's not really like a regional power or a superpower that can survive alone. Syria, of course, needs partners, needs countries to cooperate with. And in my opinion, reconstruction in Syria is not going to happen unless the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Kuwaitis invest in Syria. Who's going to invest in Syria? Of course, there will be people who will say, no, give that to Iran, give that to Russia, give that to China. The market is open since at least 2018. I mean, where are these countries and their investments? I mean, of course, Iran is suffering from an economic also bitter situation. The Russians do not have these very huge economic resources to invest. And the Chinese, it seems that they're still waiting for the entire situation to be resolved before their investment. Syrians cannot wait for that. I mean, China, if wants to rebuild Syria in 1 year, they can do it, right? Let's be honest about it. But the Chinese do not gamble. They want clear victory for Assad and restoration of the entire territories, and peace and security and stability, and after that they want to invest in Syria. And this may not happen till 3-4 years, maybe in the next 3-4 years. So Syrians cannot wait. The economic situation is so dire. So in my opinion, the Emiratis will play an important role in this. They will funnel money for reconstruction and their investment in Syria, and I don't see another way now for reconstruction. The second reason why the UAE is in Syria, because of geopolitics. It's pretty clear that the UAE and Saudi Arabia have geopolitical and crucial interest in keeping Turkey out of Syria and to push, let's say, Turkey out of Syria. They consider Turkey an occupation force, similarly to Syria. But can the Syrians engage in a brutal war against the Turks? No. Turkey has a superior army, and were it not for Russia, Syrians cannot fight alone against Turkey, right? But it seems that the situation in Idlib since 3 years is the same, almost the same. And the Russians, despite the deals they were able to strike with Erdogan didn't implement these deals. Where is the M4 highway? It was supposed to be open since 2 years now. And till today, we don't have anything underground. And Erdogan is maneuvering, and he wants to occupy more lands in Syria, right? So Russians have good relations with Erdogan, and Iranians have good relations with Erdogan, and of course, Tehran and Moscow, they have good relations with Damascus too. But because of these alliances, it's a very difficult situation for Russia and Iran to weigh in a conclusive way on the side of Syria, right? But the Saudis and the Emiratis, they're arch enemies now in the region. So I think if the economic situation is improved in Syria, the Syrian government maybe can finance their military operation in Idlib, or there would be a diplomatic activity by the UAE in the UN or in the region through the Arab League to call for the withdrawal of the Turkish occupation forces from Syria. So the UAE can play such a role. Now, there are two things I want to add. First is Israel, and the second is the Muslim Brotherhood. Israel is a very sensitive issue, as we know, for the Syrians, because Israel occupies the Golan Heights, and Syria on several occasions was able to strike a deal with Israel on the expense of the Palestinian rights, the return of the refugees into Palestine, the Palestinian refugees into Palestine, but Syria refused. And one of the major reasons why the United States is hostile towards Syria is because of Israel. The United States doesn't have any vital strategic interest in Syria except for the security of Israel, right? So is the UAE trying to bring Syria into a negotiation table with Israel? My information says no, and conclusively no. I'm reading some reports claiming that the UAE will try to persuade Syria into this normalization of relations with Israel. My information from Syria says it's a no. The UAE has not discussed with Syria about the Israeli issue at all yet. Maybe it could happen in the future. I'm not sure about it. But in my opinion, the Syrians at this particular moment do not have an interest in engaging in any sort of talks with Israel now. The second point is the Muslim Brotherhood. I can see a lot of outcry, especially on social media, by Muslim Brotherhood and some liberal and left-wing activists who are just a decoration. They're just decorations in supporting the Muslim Brotherhood projects in the region. Anyways, there is a big outcry because of the Abdullah Bin Zayed visit to Syria. In my opinion, this outcry is due to two reasons. One is because the Muslim Brotherhood know, and their forces in the region now know, that the Arabs are returning to Syria and not the other way around. It's not like Syria is rejoining the Arab world. No, it's the Arabs who are coming back to Syria because Syria never left them. It was them who left Syria alone to face this radicalism and the global war, terrorist war on Syria, right? So they know the regime change war is almost, it's 100% over. It's not even almost. And two, let's remember when Morsi came to power in Egypt, it was revealed that he sent a letter to Shimon Peres, the former president of Israel. He's now dead. And he called him my dear friend Shimon Peres. So, in my opinion, the Muslim Brotherhood, when they occupied or reached to power in Egypt and partly in Libya and Tunisia, etc., they wanted to lead this project of normalizing relations with Israel. They wanted this to happen through them, and they wanted to have a credit for it. They wanted to have a credit by the United States that they are able to make peace with Israel. So this big project of the Ikhwanization of the region, one of the reasons was for the Muslim Brotherhood to strike a deal with Israel. But now it's the UAE who is leading this this policy of normalization of relations with Israel, which, in my opinion, Syria will not join anytime soon. This campaign of the UAE to persuade and convince the Arab countries to normalize their relations with Israel. This was my insight on the recent visit of Abdullah Bin Zayed, the foreign minister of the UAE, to Syria. I think it's a very important visit. I think we will see the positive impacts, especially on the economy of Syria soon. The UAE will invest in energy sector, of course will invest in industrial sector, will invest hopefully in the educational sector, and let's hope that Syria would restore its relations with other Arab countries, because Syria always has, I mentioned this in previously and I repeat it again, Syria wants and likes to play this balancing role in the region. Syria is part of the Arab world, is not part of any other world. Let's say it is, of course, it has good relations, strategic relations with Iran and Russia, but at the end, it's part of the Arab world. And the Arabs realized that when they tried to isolate Syria, Syria became closer and closer and closer to on the side of Iran. So they don't want this. They're now coming back to Syria for the latter to be in a balancing or in a middle place again, as it was the case before 2011. In your opinion, do you think this visit is as important as I think? Do you think there will be a new stage in the Syrian war? Do you think the UAE will improve the economic situation in Syria? And do you also believe, as some people claim on social media, that the UAE is trying to persuade Syria into striking a deal with Israel? Let me know your opinion in the comments below. I've been your host, Kerak Almasian of Syriana Analysis. If you like the content of my channel, please hit the subscribe button and click on the like. It really helps me in the algorithm. And if you want to support Syriana Analysis, my independent commentary work financially, you can become a patron. The link in the description below, and see you next time.